You are standing in the Hall of Mirrors. The chandeliers flicker above you, each flame reflected 100 times in the endless glass. Perfumed air wraps around you, heavy, almost sweet enough to taste. Courtiers move like silk shadows, whispering behind painted fans. At first, it feels like a dream, until you hear it. A sound that does not belong. It is faint at first, a muffled thud, a breath drawn too sharply. Then a low, quick gasp, as though someone has been startled in the dark. Your head turns, but all you see is gold-leafed walls and the bright smiles of noblemen trading stories of the hunt. Somewhere beyond that wall, the noise comes again, this time sharper, more urgent. And you know it is not part of the music. You take a step closer to the paneling. The conversation behind you continues, but your ear is pressed to the gilded surface. Now you hear a stifled cry, the kind that escapes when someone is trying not to make a sound at all. The air in the hall feels colder. It is then you notice the tapestry. Heavy wine red, woven with the face of Apollo. Its folds tremble ever so slightly. The movement is small, invisible to anyone not looking for it. You are looking, and you see the fabric shift again, as if the wall itself is breathing. If you were anyone else, you might turn away, but you do not. Remember the rumors, the ones that claim Versailles is not just a palace, but a stage. That behind these silk curtains and gilded walls are hidden corridors, hidden rooms, and hidden lives that no visitor is meant to see. Someone brushes past you. Outered wig, the scent of bergamot. Best not to linger there, the voice says softly, without stopping. It is not a warning, it is an instruction. You step back. The music swells. Laughter bursts from a cluster of young nobles near the windows. You glance once more at the tapestry. It is still now, perfectly still, as though it had never moved at all. If the palace has secrets, they are buried behind layers of ceremony and splendor. But tonight, you have seen enough to know that the truth is here, and it is not dressed in gold. What you witnessed will never leave you. It will follow you through the mirrored corridors. It will echo in the silence between notes of the harpsichord. And it will be waiting, hidden in the folds of the next curtain you dare to touch. From a distance, Versailles looked like the very definition of civilization. Foreign envoys rode for days to stand in its courtyards, eyes wide at the fountains that seemed to flow without end. Gardens carved into perfect geometry, and halls where even the candle holders were gilded. To them, this was France at its height, a kingdom so wealthy that beauty had become its language. Guests saw the parades, the banquets, the way the king could summon an orchestra with a single gesture. They walked the Hall of Mirrors believing they were looking into the soul of Europe's most advanced nation. They returned to their countries with tales of a court so refined that even the smallest detail, down to the stitching on a servant's coat, spoke of order and power. But this was the front of the stage. Behind it, the machinery of the aristocracy turned with a precision that owed nothing to elegance. Every chandelier, every manicured hedge was paid for not only with taxes, but with lives spent in service to a system that treated people as parts of an elaborate performance. The same hands that poured wine in the king's glass might be ordered to other duties when the guests had left. For those who lived inside the palace walls, life was not all ceremony. The courtiers played their games of influence and rivalry, but their entertainments often needed more than music and conversation. Power here was not just displayed, it was exercised. And when power has no limits, it begins to reshape morality itself. We often think of luxury as harmless vanity, harmless waste of coins while peasants starve. But Versailles in the decades before the revolution was different. This was a place where indulgence had been elevated into an art form, where those at the top of society saw no need to question whether their pleasures cost more than money. Those who visited the palace saw what they were meant to see. They walked away convinced that the French nobility were the guardians of beauty and culture. They could not imagine what else the gilded doors concealed. And yet, within the same walls that hosted operas and masked balls, another kind of gathering was taking place. One not meant for public eyes. We will return to those secret gatherings soon. But to understand them, we must first understand the scale of the world that allowed them to exist. The numbers, when you see them, will make the facade of Versailles feel like glass, something beautiful, but fragile enough to shatter with a single blow. In the late 18th century, France was home to roughly 25 million people. Of these, fewer than 200,000 held noble titles. That is less than 1% of the population. Yet this fraction controlled nearly all the land, the army's leadership, and the highest offices in the kingdom. The Palace of Versailles itself cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's currency to build and maintain. Each year, more was spent on gilded frames and imported silks than on maintaining France's roads. A single ball in the Hall of Mirrors could consume enough candles to light an entire village for months. The king's household employed over 10,000 staff. Not all lived within the palace, but each played a role in maintaining the image of order and grandeur. There were stable boys whose sole duty was to polish brass buckles on harnesses, seamstresses who embroidered coats that might be worn only once, in entire teams whose task was to ensure the fountains in the gardens flowed exactly when the king passed by. But these figures only tell part of the story. Wealth here was not just counted in gold or land. It was measured in access, the ability to command service at any hour, to summon performances, to decide a person's fate with a few words. When such power was concentrated in so few hands, it did not simply remain in politics or economics. It shaped private life. The Duke of Richelieu, for example, could spend more in a month on entertainment than a provincial governor would see in a year's budget. Records from the royal treasury showed that certain noble households maintained special expenses, a sum set aside for events never listed in public accounts. These payments moved through trusted intermediaries, hidden behind coded descriptions. If you look at the ledgers, you can see the pattern. Costs marked as artistic commission or seasonal gathering appear again and again in the same handwriting, often accompanied by travel expenses to certain estates. The amounts are too high for paintings or music alone. Even in a kingdom famous for its extravagance, these numbers stand out. And they raise a question. What kind of private gathering required sums greater than an entire regiment's pay? The answer lies in an institution that would come to embody the hidden life of the French aristocracy. An invitation-only circle, protected by wealth, secrecy, and the belief that pleasure was a privilege of birth. It was here that the Facade of Versailles dissolved completely. And what lay behind it was unlike anything most of France could imagine. By the late 1740s, the Duke was one of the most influential men in France. He had money, land, and connections that reached into every salon and council chamber in Paris. But what set him apart was not his political influence. It was his understanding that the court's appetite for novelty had no limit. Versailles had long been a place where everything was for show. The opera performances, the midnight banquets, the endless masked balls. But for men and women who had seen all of this since birth, the spectacle had begun to dull. They craved something private, something beyond the reach of gossip, and the Duke intended to provide it. In 1748, he began hosting select gatherings in his townhouse in the Faubourg Saint. The invitations were never written. They were spoken in passing at the end of a conversation or whispered in the corner of a salon. Those invited were told only to come at a certain hour and to use the side entrance. From the street, the house appeared like any other noble residence. A row of tall windows, a polished door, a liveried servant waiting outside. But those who stepped inside soon realized this was no ordinary visit. The front rooms were kept deliberately conventional. Gilded chairs, portraits of ancestors, the faint scent of beeswax and lavender. Any unexpected visitor would see nothing unusual. The true gathering place lay beyond a narrow passage concealed by a folding screen. Guests passed through in twos and threes, leaving behind the polite light of the front rooms for a dimmer, more enclosed space. The corridor here was hung with heavy curtains that absorbed sound. The air was warmer, faintly perfumed, and the lighting came from lamps set low to the floor. The central salon was arranged in a wide oval, its walls lined with cushioned benches. In the middle of the room, a carpeted space stood clear. When the guests arrived, they found one or two young people already there, sometimes male, sometimes female, often in their teens or early 20s. They were dressed simply in loose shirts or thin gowns tied at the waist. No wigs, no jewelry. Their hair might be brushed and arranged, but never in the elaborate styles of the court. The simplicity made it easier to see them, to study the way their bodies moved under fabric. The evening always began with silence. The Duke would greet his guests, then step back to let them observe. The young people were told to walk the length of the room, to pause, in turn to kneel on the carpet, to hold a position with their hands folded in front or clasped behind their back. Members sometimes rose from their benches to adjust a posture, a shoulder drawn back, chin lifted, a hand placed differently, before returning to their seat. No one asked whether the young people agreed to any of it. That question was irrelevant here. Their role was to comply. A slow nod from the Duke was enough to signal the next instruction. Sometimes a guest might test the stillness of a pose by stepping very close, speaking softly into an ear, or brushing a strand of hair away from the face. Others would circle at a deliberate pace, commenting on muscle tone, on skin texture, on the angle of a jaw. The language was that of art criticism, but the effect was not. The young people kept their eyes down, unless told to look up. The selection process for these evenings was equally controlled. The Duke's agents, often household stewards or trusted merchants, identified possible candidates in the city and countryside. A particular hair color might be sought for a planned theme, a certain height for symmetry when standing beside another performer. Some were enticed with promises of domestic service or stage work. Others were brought in by families eager to secure a noble's favor. Before appearing in the salon, each was assessed in private. Could they hold a position for 10 minutes without shifting? Could they endure a stranger's hand adjusting their stance without recoiling? Those who could not were dismissed. Those who passed were instructed in how to respond to commands, always promptly, always without question. When the evening drew to a close, the young people were led quietly from the room, down a side passage that kept them from crossing paths with the departing guests. The guests remained in the salon, wine now circulating freely, voices rising as they discussed the evening's arrangements. It was here that the Duke would extend offers of membership. His pitch was always the same. This was l'art de vivre, the art of living. It was not debauchery but cultivation, an exploration of human form, obedience, and beauty at its most refined. Members could commission their own evenings, choosing the number, appearance, and role of the participants. The society would handle the rest, the selection, the instruction, the staging. The price of entry was silence. Nothing that happened inside these rooms was to be spoken of elsewhere. Any breach of discretion would mean social exile, invitations withdrawn, debts called in, influence dismantled. For men and women whose lives depended on reputation, the threat was enough. By the early 1750s, the society had taken shape. Its gatherings grew more intricate. The center carpet was replaced with raised platforms to display performers at different heights. Costumes were introduced, tunics, draped fabrics, masks, but always light enough to adjust or remove as required for the scene. Those who came understood the unspoken rule. This was a place where the body of another person could be directed like a living prop, where proximity could be taken without permission, where hands might rest on a shoulder, linger at the back of the neck, trace the line of a jaw, not as affection, but as possession. The Duke did not see it as cruelty. He saw it as refinement. And his guests, once drawn in, rarely left. The society offered them something Versailles could not: privacy, control, and the assurance that their desires would never leave the confines of those curtained walls. By the time a member's proposal for an evening was approved by the Conseil d'Art, the outline was already precise. There was no improvisation here. Every gesture, every step, every point of contact had been planned before the first guest arrived. The process began with selection. The Bureau's agents knew exactly what to look for: an age range, hair color, height, even the way a person carried themselves. Sometimes the choice was practical. A scene might require performers who could balance trays, hold musical instruments, or stand in symmetrical formations. Other times it was purely aesthetic. The candidates were approached with different stories. Some were told they had been offered temporary work in a noble household. Others heard of opportunities to model for artists or perform in courtly entertainments. A few were sent directly by their families, believing they were securing a better future for their child. Whatever the reason, once inside the mansion, the reality became clear. The first stage was assessment. In a quiet room with shuttered windows, the candidates were told to stand in the center, turn slowly, then walk to a marked spot and back again. They were asked to kneel, to clasp their hands behind their back, to tilt their heads toward the light. 2 or 3 members observed in silence, occasionally stepping forward to reposition an arm or correct posture. A servant recorded notes. If they hesitated, the instructions were repeated more firmly. If they flinched at being touched, the observers exchanged glances. Some were dismissed immediately, others were kept, not because they were at ease, but because their discomfort was considered part of the appeal. Once selected, the training began. They learned how to move exactly as instructed, to step forward and stop on command, to kneel on hard floors without shifting, to stand close enough for a member to adjust a collar or smooth fabric without stepping back. They were told never to initiate conversation, never to look away if ordered to make eye contact, never to refuse a change in position. This preparation could last days or weeks. During this time, the performer's clothing for the event was chosen. Sometimes it was an elaborate costume of light silk, loosely fastened so it could be altered in seconds. Other times it was simpler, a tunic, a draped sheet, a piece of cloth pinned at the shoulder. Always, the fabric was chosen to reveal the shape beneath, whether through fit or through the way it shifted when touched. When the evening came, the mansion transformed. Rooms were arranged to match the chosen theme: a classical banquet, a pastoral scene, a tableau from a painting. Low cushions and couches replaced formal chairs. Curtains were drawn to soften the light, and candles were placed to create deliberate shadows. The air smelled faintly of perfume and warmed wax. The guests arrived masked and cloaked, speaking quietly as they were led through the prepared spaces. The first room might hold a single performer posed as if in mid-action, leaning to pour wine into a goblet, for example, and instructed not to move until released. Guests stepped close, inspecting the stillness, speaking in low tones about the control required to hold the position. In another room, 2 or 3 performers might kneel on cushions beside a low table, while nobles reclined opposite them. The performers were instructed to serve food or refill glasses, their movements slow and careful. If a hand brushed against them, they were to keep their focus on the task. Guests might deliberately drop a piece of fruit, watch the performer retrieve it, and then take their time returning to conversation. One of the most notorious productions whispered about long after was inspired by the Garden of Earthly Delights. The central salon was converted into a miniature garden, complete with potted trees and painted backdrops. Performers were arranged throughout, their skin painted in vivid colors and patterns to match the imagined landscape. Thin fabric covered them in places, leaving other areas bare except for pigment. Guests walked among them, pausing to examine a painted shoulder or run a finger over the edge of a design to see if it would smudge. Everything was done in public view within the room, but the power dynamic was unmistakable. The performers could not step back. They could not lower their eyes without permission. Even the smallest reaction, a held breath, a tightened jaw, became part of the art for the guests to observe. The members justified these arrangements as living sculpture, claiming they were reviving the ancient tradition of the human form as the highest subject of art. They spoke of balance, composition, and color. But what they were truly arranging was proximity, submission, and control, staged so elegantly that those present could pretend it was something more refined than it was. The psychological effect on the performers was not discussed, but it was visible. Some stared ahead without expression, their bodies rigid, waiting for the end of their role. Others complied quickly, even smiling when addressed, knowing that a cheerful mask could shorten the evening. For all, the message was the same. Their own wishes had no place here. After the final scene, the guests were led to a separate salon for wine and discussion. The performers were taken away through side passages, their costumes loosened or removed by attendants. The paint was scrubbed from their skin with rough cloths and cold water, leaving red marks that would fade in a day or two. No one asked whether they had enjoyed the evening. The consigliere would later review the event, discussing what had worked and what could be improved. They might suggest a slower pace for the serving scenes, a change in lighting for the painted tableau, or a different posture for a performer in the next production. These critiques were delivered with the seriousness of a theater director analyzing a premiere. In the society's mind, these evenings were the pinnacle of l'art de vivre. But the truth was simpler and far less noble. They were carefully choreographed exercises in command, an opportunity for the most privileged people in France to decide how another person would stand, move, and be touched, without the smallest possibility of refusal. To the outside world, the society claimed to be an intellectual and artistic circle. Inside its curtained rooms, it was something else entirely. By the early 1760s, the Duca society had become an open secret in Paris. Those in the highest circles knew of its gatherings, even if they had never attended. Whispers spread through the salons, always vague, always half-denied, about the artistic evenings staged behind its closed doors. Louis XV had heard of it long before he saw it. At first, the stories were flattering, cultured productions that blended theater, sculpture, and philosophy in ways no public stage could match. The Duke's allies spoke of harmony and beauty, of human form as a living canvas. They knew better than to describe the control, the inspection, the way participants were told to hold themselves still while others moved around them. One spring evening in 1762, the king decided to see for himself. He arrived quietly, without the full weight of royal ceremony, slipping through a side entrance at the mansion on Faubourg Saint. The rooms at the front of the house were unremarkable. Warm light, gilded mirrors, polite music drifting from a harpsichord. But as the Duke led him deeper, the corridors narrowed, and the air took on a faint scent of warmed oil and perfume. In the central salon, the evening scene was already in place. 6 performers, 3 men, 3 women, stood in 2 rows on a raised platform. Their garments were light and loosely tied, their hair arranged simply. The lighting was low, designed so that faces were in soft shadow, while the lines of shoulders and arms caught the glow of the candles. The king sat among the guests, observing as the performers shifted slowly between arranged positions. A nobleman rose, approached one of the women, and adjusted the fall of her sleeve, so that more of her arm was visible. Another guest stepped behind one of the men, setting a hand lightly on his back to straighten his posture. The movements were deliberate, unhurried, and without any question of refusal. Louis XV noticed the silence. No one spoke to the performers. Instructions were given with a glance, a gesture, or the briefest murmur. The performers responded instantly, changing their stance, turning their faces toward or away from the light, lowering their eyes when told. After an hour, the guests were led to the next room. Here the arrangement was different. Low couches in a semicircle, with 2 performers kneeling on the carpet in the center. They poured wine, served small dishes, and refilled goblets without looking up unless addressed. One guest deliberately let a grape fall to the floor. The nearest performer picked it up, placed it back on the plate, and resumed serving without hesitation. The king stayed until the final scene, in which the performers stood side by side as the guests passed slowly before them. Some members leaned close, examining the fabrics, brushing away a strand of hair, or running a finger along the edge of a painted design to see if it would smear. When the evening ended, the guests withdrew to a private salon to drink and speak freely. The performers were led away down a side corridor. Louis XV said nothing immediately, but the Duke knew he had made an impression. Within weeks, the king gave his answer, not in words, but in an action that changed everything. He created a new office within his household administration, the Bureau d'études philosophiques, the Bureau of Philosophical Studies. Officially, its purpose was to promote scholarly investigation into art, aesthetics, and the human form. In practice, it became the society's logistical arm. With the Bureau's authority, resources could be moved across France under the cover of cultural research. Recruitment trips could be justified on paper as searches for models, musicians, or costumed performers for historical recreations. The Bureau secretary kept meticulous records. Each event was listed with the date, the names of the members who attended, the number, and description of the performers and any special arrangements requested. These were written in plain but careful language, garment altered for better visibility. Performer instructed to maintain position for extended duration, adjusted lighting to enhance complexion. For the members, the Bureau's existence was a guarantee. It meant that if anyone outside their circle questioned the nature of the gatherings, there was an official explanation ready, complete with royal seal and signatures. The word research could be applied to anything, from painting skin with pigment to staging scenes in which performers were positioned for hours while guests moved around them. Royal protection also meant expansion. The Faubourg mansion was no longer the society's only venue. Country estates were prepared for larger productions, especially those that required outdoor settings or more elaborate staging. Guests could now be invited from other cities, even from abroad, without fear that the wrong kind of rumor would spread. The king himself attended on more than one occasion. Sometimes he sat quietly, observing. Other times, he participated in minor adjustments, straightening a performer's collar, asking one to hold a position longer, or requesting that a scene be repeated with the lighting changed. His presence gave the society an authority that no whisper of scandal could erode. With the Bureau's resources, the productions grew more ambitious. Entire rooms were refitted for specific events. Platforms were built to allow performers to be displayed at different heights. Mirrors were placed to give guests multiple angles of the same figure. Every change was logged in the Bureau's records, along with costs for materials, attendance, and transportation. For those inside the circle, this was a golden age. They could order scenes, adjust them at will, and know that every expense would be justified as part of the king's cultural project. For those brought in to perform, it meant that resistance had no weight. Refusal was meaningless when the instructions came under royal authority. The Duke understood the value of this new arrangement. With the king's blessing, the society no longer needed to hide. Its secrecy was no longer about avoiding discovery, but about preserving exclusivity. What had begun as a private indulgence had become an institution, efficient, protected and confident that its position was unassailable. By the late 1780s, the confidence that had defined the society began to erode. Outside the palace walls, France was changing. Bread prices soared. Crowds gathered in marketplaces to shout about taxes and shortages. In Paris, pamphlets attacking the nobility circulated like wildfire, their language sharper than anything the censors could keep up with. At first, the unrest felt far away from the salons and estates. The society's members still met, still staged their elaborate evenings. But there were signs, subtle, then impossible to ignore, that the curtain was slipping. The Bureau's procurement networks, once invisible, began to draw attention. In villages near certain estates, families whispered about sons and daughters who had gone to the city for work and never returned. Municipal records showed clusters of missing persons in areas tied to the society's agents. These patterns did not go unnoticed by revolutionary committees already searching for proof of aristocratic corruption. In 1792, during a raid on a Paris townhouse belonging to one of the society's lesser members, a locked trunk was discovered. Inside were ledgers bearing the Bureau's seal. They were not coded for outsiders. Each page listed names, dates, and expenses in unambiguous detail. Among the entries were references to productions held for visiting foreign dignitaries, complete with notes on the arrangements made for their participation. Word spread quickly. What had been rumor became confirmed fact. The press seized on the story, framing it as the ultimate proof that the nobility were not only indifferent to the suffering of the people, but actively feeding their pleasures on it. Revolutionary guards descended on known members. Some fled the country before warrants could be served. Others took their own lives rather than face the humiliation of public trial. Those who stayed were often paraded before tribunals, where the Bureau's ledgers were read aloud. Each entry punctuated by jeers from the crowd. The Duke of, once untouchable, was imprisoned. He had hoped his revolutionary sympathies might save him, but the records were too detailed, his involvement too deep. On the eve of his trial, he was found dead in his cell, the official report calling it poison. In the countryside, estates tied to the society were looted. Some of the private theaters and preparation rooms were destroyed on the spot, others carefully dismantled to be used as evidence. Portions of the Bureau's archives were burned by clerks loyal to the crown, but not before enough survived to damn dozens of the most prominent families in France. International repercussions followed. Correspondence in the archives revealed that similar circles existed in other European capitals. Embarrassed governments scrambled to suppress the connection. But in the age of revolution, no elite could be certain their secrets would remain buried. The society, as it had existed, was gone. But the idea that power could be exercised in private under the cover of culture did not vanish with it. It simply retreated, waiting for another time, another place, where the lessons of Versailles would be forgotten. What happened inside the salons of Versailles is not just a footnote to the French Revolution, it is a warning. Absolute power rarely announces itself as tyranny. More often it cloaks itself in refinement, in art, in philosophy, in the language of culture. And when no one dares to question it, that refinement becomes a shield for cruelty. The members of the society believed they were connoisseurs of beauty, patrons of the highest form of living. They told themselves they were exploring the boundaries of human experience, that their privilege gave them the right to do so. But history strips away those justifications. What remains is the record, the names, the dates, the budgets, the quiet disappearances. It is tempting to see them as uniquely corrupt, as villains from another age. But the truth is more unsettling. They were products of their system, shaped by the certainty that their actions would never face judgment. Remove the checks on power, and the pattern will appear again, in any time, in any place. Even after the revolution, many of the archives were destroyed, many witnesses silenced. Yet enough survived to show us exactly how it worked. How an idea, wrapped in the elegance of l'art de vivre, could consume lives without a second thought. The lesson is not locked in the 18th century. It belongs to every society that believes its leaders too cultured, too intelligent, too sophisticated to commit harm. If you've listened this far, you already know that history's most dangerous truths are often the ones hidden behind the brightest facades. And you may be wondering what other secrets, equally polished, are waiting to be uncovered. If you like learning about the histories that official accounts prefer to forget, it's the ones that leave you unsettled long after the story ends, then stay with us. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, whether the story of Versailles has changed the way you see the past. And if you're ready to hear about another chapter of history that those in power tried to erase, click the video on your screen now. Because what you've heard tonight is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle we are just beginning to put back together.